What if everything we know about human origins has a hidden chapter, one written in clay, buried beneath the sands of time? For centuries, the Sumerian tablets have held secrets far older than the pyramids and more complex than mythology dares to admit. Welcome back, explorers of the forgotten past. If you're fascinated by ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and the stories written before history began, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a revelation. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if this story stirs your curiosity, share the video with a friend who loves unraveling ancient secrets. That's how we keep these echoes of history alive. Now let's see if you can follow the trail. Do you truly understand what the Sumerian texts reveal about the Anunnaki before they ever arrived on Earth? The mystery of humanity's beginnings does not start with pyramids or prophets, nor with marble columns or chariots of war. It begins much earlier, in silence, among the marshes and rivers of a land now called Iraq. Here, in the cradle of civilization, people long gone pressed their thoughts into wet clay, using sharpened reeds to shape the first writing system. These clay tablets, forgotten under sands and rubble for thousands of years, carry whispers of a time when gods walked among humans, and the world was raw with wonder and fear, before hieroglyphs, before alphabets, before Homer or Moses or Plato. There were the Sumerians, and they recorded a vision of the world that still stirs the imagination today. The land they inhabited was not easy. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was a place of extremes. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers brought life and destruction in equal measure. Floods came without warning, sweeping away crops and villages. In their wake, they left dark, fertile silt perfect for farming, but hard to predict. Unlike the predictable Nile, these rivers were temperamental, and so were the gods who governed them. In this uncertainty, the Sumerians built their civilization, and they filled their stories with gods of wind and storm, of wisdom and fertility, gods who blessed and punished without warning. It was a worldview shaped by a chaotic environment, and the divine mirrored that chaos, powerful, mysterious, sometimes merciful, often cruel. It's easy in the modern age to forget what it meant to face a world full of dangers with no explanation but divine will. Disease, flood, drought, and famine were not random misfortunes, they were messages. Every event had a cause, and that cause was divine. The gods watched, judged, and acted. The Sumerians did not believe themselves to be the masters of their world. They believed they were servants of beings beyond comprehension. And yet, in service to those gods, they created cities, temples, and most remarkably, writing. The invention of writing was not a scientific breakthrough in our modern sense. It was an act of reverence, to record the will of the gods, the names of kings, the flow of barley, or the words of a hymn was to bring order to chaos. It was to carve meaning into the shifting sands of time. These tablets are not speculative. They are not legend passed by word of mouth alone. They are physical, real, touchable artifacts, inscribed with lines and wedges that speak of contracts, festivals, prayers, punishments, and praises. And in them, we encounter names that echo through history: Inanna, Enki, Enlil, Utu, and the Anunnaki, the most misunderstood beings in all ancient literature. They have been recast in modern times as aliens, as astronauts, as genetic engineers from distant planets. But what did the Sumerians actually say? What did these people, who lived more than 5,000 years ago, really believe? That is what we seek to uncover, not through speculation, but through translation, through respect, through listening. Before we interpret, we must observe. Before we project, we must understand. These tablets, tens of thousands of them, survived not because someone wanted them preserved, but because clay, once fired, becomes stone. When cities burned, the libraries baked. It is one of the ironies of history that destruction preserved the past. The same fire that collapsed temples preserved their archives, and so today, archaeologists can pull these tablets from ruins and read what a Sumerian scribe wrote about the price of goats, or the divine lineage of kings, or the rituals of mourning. Some texts are dry and administrative, others are electric with emotion. All are alive with the voice of a civilization that knew it was small, fragile, and temporary, but determined to speak to the future. Let us not forget how recent our understanding is. It was only in the 19th century that Europeans, digging in ancient mounds across Iraq, began to unearth these tablets. For a long time, they were undecipherable mystery, wrapped in mystery. It was only with the discovery of inscriptions written in multiple languages, like the Behistun inscription, that the wedge-shaped script, known as cuneiform, was finally unlocked. Once understood, these marks revealed a world as rich and complex as any we had imagined in mythology. But it was not mythology, it was real. The Sumerians were real. Their cities had walls and granaries. Their gods had temples and feasts. Their stories were not whispers, they were declarations etched in clay. To read these tablets today is to open a door into the oldest stratum of recorded thought. We hear the voices of priests praising their deities, of farmers measuring out their grain, of kings justifying their wars, and of poets contemplating the great mysteries of love, death, and the afterlife. These voices are not ours, but they are familiar. They speak of family and loss, of duty and fear, of hope and awe. They speak of the same sun we see rise, the same moon we see set, and above all, they speak of the desire to make sense of the world. In that, we are still their children. So before we leap to theories of extraterrestrial engineers or hidden ancient technologies, let us do something far more radical. Let us listen. Let us hear what the Sumerians actually said about their gods, their world, and themselves. Let us understand them not as a puzzle to be solved, but as people to be heard. Let us walk with them through the fields of ancient Sumer, where the scent of barley once drifted on the breeze, and the ziggurats rose like stairways to the sky. Let us sit with the scribes as they pressed symbols into clay by lamplight, recording the will of gods and kings alike. Let us honor the voices of those who spoke across millennia, not to confuse us or dazzle us with mystery, but to tell us plainly what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped. The story begins not with aliens, but with awe, not with secrets, but with seeking. This is not a story about ancient astronauts. It is a story about ancient people, people who dared to write, to question, to imagine, and to record what they thought they saw in the vast sky above and the trembling earth beneath their feet. When we imagine the ancient world, we often picture stone huts, tribal camps, or scattered farming villages clinging to riverbanks. But around 4,500 BCE, something happened in the southernmost stretch of Mesopotamia, something transformative. In a land defined by the unpredictable rhythms of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humans took one of the boldest steps in their history. They created cities, not just clusters of homes, but sprawling, organized urban centers with thousands, then tens of thousands of people. This was not a gradual improvement. It was a leap, a radical reorganization of how people lived, worked, and worshipped. The land would become known as Sumer, and it was here that human civilization was reborn in brick, ritual, and law. Sumer was not the first place where humans farmed, but it was the first where farming led to complexity on this scale. Agriculture had long been practiced across the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant. People had already been growing barley and wheat, domesticating sheep and goats, and living in small permanent settlements for thousands of years. But what happened in Sumer was different in kind. Not just in size. These were not enlarged villages. They were something new, dense. Hierarchical societies that needed systems for managing water, labor, grain, trade, and power. In the flat plains near the Gulf, people built Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash cities with names that still echo with reverence in archaeological circles. The most famous among them, Uruk, was a marvel. By 2900 BCE, it may have been the largest city in the world, with a population of 50, 000 to 80. 000 people. To put that into perspective, remember that for most of human history, people lived in groups of 20 to 200. Cities like Uruk required people to live in proximity with others they didn't know, to work together with strangers, to obey laws created by someone they'd never met, to place their trust in abstract systems. This was an evolutionary leap in social complexity, and it brought with it both marvel and danger. Cooperation allowed for irrigation canals, temples, trade routes, and monumental architecture, but it also demanded control, hierarchy, and punishment. The need for food drove much of this innovation. Sumer received little rain, but the rivers could be harnessed through irrigation. Complex canal systems spread water across the dry fields, making the land astonishingly fertile when the rivers cooperated. The effort to manage this water became the foundation of the state. Without canals, there was no food. Without organization, there were no canals. And so, from the soil rose not just crops, but bureaucracy. Kings and priests emerged not only as leaders, but as managers, keepers of time, labor, and divine favor. The gods were said to dwell in the temples, but they also lived in the ledger, in the grain rations, in the meticulous plans for canal maintenance. Here, religion and administration were one. The ziggurats at the heart of these cities rose like steps into the heavens. These weren't just monuments to divine glory, they were anchors for the city's entire structure. Around the temple clustered granaries, workshops, homes of officials, and eventually markets and public squares. From the center radiated layers of society. The closer you were to the temple, both physically and socially, the more power and privilege you had. High officials and priests lived in large homes with courtyards. Craftspeople and merchants worked and lived further out. Laborers and farmers resided at the margins, close to the walls that defined the edge of the urban world. Beyond those walls, the land was organized for cultivation, measured, taxed, and divided. It's hard to overstate how revolutionary this was. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had lived in scattered communities with strong kinship ties. Now, in Sumer, people lived side by side with strangers. Social bonds were not just familial, they were civic. You were no longer just a member of a tribe. You were a citizen of Uruk, a servant of Inanna, a participant in the machinery of the city. This required new rules, legal systems, courts, scribes to record agreements and disputes. It required central storage for food, systematic distribution of labor, coordination of public works, and it required belief in the gods. Yes, but also belief in the city itself, in the necessity of shared order. Sumerian cities were not held together by brute force alone. They were held together by shared myths, shared rituals, and a shared understanding of purpose. The cities were full of specialized labor. There were not only farmers, but potters, weavers, brewers, carpenters, and builders. The temple complex employed workers who made textiles, crafted tools, prepared food, and stored surplus grain. Trade routes stretched from the Gulf to the mountains of Iran and Anatolia, bringing tin, copper, a stone, and timber in exchange for Sumerian wool and grain. This kind of economy had never existed before. And to manage it all, a class of administrators and scribes emerged, people whose job was not to plant or harvest, but to write, to record, to manage. Power in these cities did not always rest with kings. In early Sumer, temples and priests often held more power than any one ruler. The gods were seen as the true owners of the land. Kings ruled on their behalf, often acting as high priests themselves. Over time, secular kingship became more pronounced, and dynasties began to emerge. But even then, the legitimacy of kingship depended on divine favor. Without the gods, there was no authority. Without temples, there was no state. As the cities grew, so did the problems. Who controlled the water? Who distributed the food? What happened when crops failed or disputes arose? These pressures led to laws, written laws, carved in stone, meant to endure. The Sumerians were among the first to write down legal codes. Long before Hammurabi's famous laws, they understood that without law, a city of tens of thousands could not function. The Sumerian city was a fragile miracle, balanced on cooperation and coercion, devotion and fear. But it worked. For centuries, these cities thrived. They built canals, ziggurats, libraries, and palaces. They sent envoys to distant lands and received tribute from smaller villages. They recorded their deeds on clay. They composed hymns and prayers and stories. They asked hard questions about life and death, and they tried to answer them through poetry, ritual, and myth. These were not people lost in superstition. They were builders of the first great experiment in human civilization, urban life. The birth of cities in Sumer was not inevitable. It was the result of countless decisions, coordinated efforts, and cultural innovations. It changed what it meant to be human. No longer simply gatherers or planters or hunters. People became citizens, workers, traders, and thinkers. They created systems that allowed knowledge to endure, that turned chaos into structure, and that gave rise to everything that followed: law, literature, religion, and the idea that a people could create a world larger than their tribe, larger even than their lifetime. To walk through a Sumerian city in its prime was to enter a world where architecture spoke the language of the gods. The design of the city was not accidental, it was intentional, sacred, and deeply symbolic. At the center of every great Sumerian city stood a structure unlike anything the world had ever seen: the ziggurat. These stepped pyramids were not merely temples, they were mountains built by human hands, artificial peaks rising from a flat plain, reaching for the sky, anchoring heaven to earth. They represented humanity's deepest longing to connect with the divine and the growing belief that structure, symmetry, and elevation brought one closer to cosmic truth. The ziggurat was the heart of the city. Around it, the city unfolded like an organism, every part connected to the center. The temples were not merely places of worship, they were administrative complexes, economic hubs, and spiritual engines. The largest of these structures, such as the ziggurat of Ur or the Iana complex in Uruk, were built over generations. Each level was laid with thousands upon thousands of mud bricks, fired or dried in the Mesopotamian sun, stamped with the marks of kings who ordered their construction. The base was wide and powerful, each successive level smaller, culminating in a shrine or temple at the summit, a sacred space believed to be the dwelling place of the city's patron deity. These deities were not distant abstractions, they were household names. In Uruk, it was Inanna, goddess of love and war, who ruled the skies from atop her ziggurat. In Nippur, it was Enlil, lord of storms and fates. These gods were woven into every part of the city's function: the layout of the streets, the storage of grain, the assignments of labor, all were part of the divine economy. The city was not just a political entity, it was a living temple. Every brick laid in the ziggurat was an act of devotion, every canal dug, every jar filled, Every field, measured and scribed into a tablet, was done under the watchful eye of the gods. The temple precincts were alive with activity. Granaries stored the city's food supply, feeding both temple workers and distributing rations across the population. Workshops bustled with potters, weavers, metal workers, and brewers. Scribes sat in shaded courtyards with styluses and tablets, recording the flow of goods, the outcomes of disputes, and the decrees of priests. These temples owned vast tracts of land, employed hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers, and functioned as early models of centralized economic planning. It was through the temples that the city pulsed with life, not only religiously, but economically and politically. Beyond the temple walls, the residential quarters began. The wealthiest administrators and priests lived closest to the center, in spacious homes with courtyards and storage rooms, their walls plastered and sometimes decorated. Further out were the craftsmen, living above or beside their workshops, producing tools, ornaments, and household goods. At the outer edges lived the laborers, the farmers, the people whose backs carried the weight of the city. These were modest homes, small, flat-roofed, often just 1 or 2 rooms, but they were permanent. This was no temporary settlement. This was civilization. Even the streets were designed with function and symbolism in mind. Narrow, winding alleyways kept homes shaded from the punishing heat. Larger avenues connected major buildings, allowing for processions during festivals. During these holy days, the entire city became a stage. Statues of gods were carried through the streets. Music echoed off mud-brick walls. Offerings were burned. Dances were performed. These festivals were not mere entertainment, they were acts of cosmic renewal. The movement through space was meaningful. The geometry of the city became a choreography of worship. One of the most powerful aspects of Sumerian urban design was its fusion of utility and meaning. The ziggurat was both a literal storage place and a cosmic mountain. The granaries were both food banks and sacred trust. The scribes were accountants and priests. There was no division between the sacred and the mundane. To plant a field was to serve the gods. To brew beer was to participate in a sacred tradition. To dig a canal was to fulfill the divine order. In every brick, every wall, every alley, there was purpose. And that purpose extended even into the city's edges. The fields that fed the city were not random plots of land. They were laid out in precise grids, measured by surveyors, crisscrossed with irrigation ditches and canals. Water was life, and controlling it was the key to survival. But controlling water meant controlling people. The distribution of water was a central task of temple administration. Priests and officials kept careful records of who received how much water, when and for what purpose. Disputes over irrigation rights were common and required legal resolution. The law, too, became sacred, a reflection of cosmic balance. Every city was both unique and yet fundamentally similar in structure, guided by the same cosmological principles. At the core, the ziggurat, rising tier upon tier, connected earth and sky. Around it, the beating heart of the temple economy. Beyond that, homes, workshops, and streets, all surrounded by walls that not only protected from invaders, but symbolized the boundary between order and chaos. Outside the walls lay the wilds, the deserts, the nomads, the unknown. Inside was the city, a microcosm of the universe, ordered, measured, blessed. There is compelling evidence that the orientation and alignment of some ziggurats were intentional and cosmologically significant. Some faced specific cardinal directions, others may have been built to align with solstices or lunar cycles, integrating celestial events into architectural space. This suggests that urban planning was not only political and practical, but also astronomical, a mirror of the sky on Earth. Cities became maps of the cosmos, and living within them was to inhabit a sacred diagram. Residents did not simply walk to work or visit the market. They moved through a divine framework, a landscape designed to reflect the order of the heavens. To live in a Sumerian city was to walk beneath the gaze of gods, seen and unseen. It is a testament to Sumerian genius that their cities lasted centuries, even millennia. Uruk, for example, remained continuously inhabited for over 3,000 years. Imagine a city so resilient, so spiritually and socially cohesive, that it outlived empire after empire, dynasty after dynasty. These were not mere concentrations of people, they were sacred systems, reflections of the divine on earth. The ziggurat, towering above it all, reminded every resident of their place in the cosmos, not just as individuals, but as parts of something larger, divine, ordered, eternal. In a world without books, without paper, without even an alphabet, the Sumerians gave birth to something extraordinary writing, and they did it not for poetry, not at first, but for survival. The need to record grain rations, land ownership, livestock counts, and temple inventories gave rise to the most transformative invention in human history. Somewhere around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, in the temple offices of Uruk, scribes began pressing styluses made from reeds into soft clay, carving marks that would eventually evolve into a system known as cuneiform. This was not merely a breakthrough, it was a revolution in how humans relate to memory, authority, and time. The earliest writing was pictographic. A stylized drawing of a sheep meant sheep. A bowl represented food. These images captured objects, not sounds, and they were limited in scope. But even these early signs were powerful. They created permanence. A mark in clay could outlast generations. But the genius of the Sumerians lay in their desire to expand that system. They needed to write not just what, but how, who, and why. They needed to describe relationships, actions, and ownership. So the writing evolved. The signs became abstract, reduced to combinations of wedges and lines, easier to produce and more flexible in meaning. From there, it transformed from pictographs into a system capable of representing spoken language, a shift that changed everything. This phonetic turn was revolutionary. A sign no longer meant just cow, but could represent the sound ka. That sound could be part of a name, a verb, or an abstract idea. With this innovation, the Sumerians broke the chains of literal thought and entered a realm where writing could express anything that could be said. Ideas, dreams, decrees, hymns, and prayers all could now be preserved in clay. The spoken word, once as fleeting as breath, could be made permanent. For the first time in history, language could outlive the speaker. The past could speak directly to the future. The material used, clay, was both humble and miraculous. It was abundant in Mesopotamia, easily shaped and impressively durable. Once dried or fired, clay tablets could last thousands of years. That durability is why we can read them today. The heat of ancient fires, wars, collapses, disasters accidentally baked the tablets, preserving them far beyond their intended use. Thousands have been found in temples, palaces, archives, and even in trash heaps. Some were discarded drafts, others were masterpieces of literature or records of international diplomacy. Each one was a message meant for someone, often practical, sometimes sacred, always human. Learning to write in cuneiform was no small feat. It required years of rigorous training in a scribal school known as the Adaba, or tablet house. Boys, almost always boys, began their training around age 7 or 8. Their first lessons involved mastering the stylus and the soft clay, forming basic signs over and over in repetition. These students practiced on small tablets, often inscribed with a single symbol dozens of times. The repetition was tedious, but essential. It built muscle memory. discipline, and the beginnings of literacy in a form no modern child would recognize. As students advanced, they copied word lists, syllabaries, and then entire texts. They memorized the meanings and uses of hundreds of signs. They learned grammar, syntax, mathematics, geometry, accounting, and law. They studied poetry and religious texts, as well as commercial records. They learned how to calculate the area of a field, how to divide rations of beer and barley, how to record loans and taxes. Some students specialized, becoming experts in astronomy, medicine, or administration. The scribe was not just a writer, he was an engineer, an accountant, a priest, a lawyer, and a scientist, all rolled into one. The daily life of a scribe was demanding. He sat cross-legged on the floor, clay tablet in hand, stylus poised. Each sign had to be pressed cleanly, precisely. The timing mattered too. The clay had to be moist enough to accept the impression, but not so soft that the marks would blur or collapse. The work required intense concentration and skill. Errors could cost lives or fortunes. A mistake in a legal document, a miscount in grain allocation, a miscopied omen could lead to chaos. Yet through this labor, the scribes became the keepers of knowledge, the voices of order. In a world of uncertainty, writing gave the Sumerians something that no civilization had before, a way to transcend death. Before writing, knowledge was held in the minds of elders and passed through memory and speech. But memory fades, and stories change. Writing fixed knowledge in time. It allowed the dead to speak. It let kings boast. Gods command. Lovers weep. And priests record sacred ritual with consistency. With cuneiform, the Sumerians created time capsules. And when we unearth these clay slates, we do not just find artifacts, we find voices. Some of those voices are prosaic, a record of 3 goats traded for a measure of barley. Others are profound. We read poems written to Inanna, hymns praising Enlil, philosophical dialogues about the meaning of life, myths that explore death, chaos, and creation. The richness is staggering. They wrote medical treatises and multiplication tables, prayers and curses, letters between fathers and sons, and, most importantly, they wrote down their stories, their epics, their cosmologies, their questions and answers about why the world is the way it is. These are not just records of history. They are expressions of consciousness. The Sumerians were not just administrators or farmers. They were thinkers, dreamers, artists. And all of it began with that first stroke into clay. That first mark wasn't just an administrative tool. It was a declaration. We exist. We remember. We speak to the future. Cuneiform was their mirror and their ladder, reflecting their world and elevating their thoughts. It connected the mundane to the divine, the material to the eternal. In the grooves of these tablets lies the soul of the world's first true civilization. In ancient Sumer, to be a scribe was to hold power, quiet, precise, and enduring. The cities of Mesopotamia could not function without these men who mastered the art of writing. They were the minds behind the state, the temples, the economy, and the stories. While kings ruled and priests performed rituals, it was the scribes who recorded every contract, who calculated every measure, who preserved the names of gods and the laws of men. Their work was hidden behind the surface of things, yet absolutely essential. Without them, the entire machinery of civilization would crumble. The path to becoming a scribe was long and grueling. It began in childhood, around the age of 7 or 8, when a boy would enter the Adaba, the tablet house. This was no gentle classroom. It was a place of discipline, hierarchy, and relentless repetition. Students sat cross-legged on the floor with slabs of clay on their laps and reed styluses in hand. They began by copying basic signs over and over again, learning not only the strokes themselves, but the posture, timing, and pressure needed to impress each wedge properly into the clay. The earliest student tablets we've uncovered bear silent witness to this process, pages filled with shaky signs. Many corrected by harsh-handed teachers. Discipline was strict, and failure was not tolerated lightly. One surviving letter from a frustrated father berates his son for wasting time in taverns instead of studying his tablets. Other texts speak of beatings, administered for sloppy handwriting or for failure to memorize lists. Yet, despite the harshness, there was a sense of prestige in this education. Most families could not afford to send their sons to the Aduba. Those who did were investing in a future of stability and status. To become a scribe meant rising above manual labor. It meant becoming part of the city's intellectual and administrative elite. The training was extensive. Scribes learned to read and write hundreds of cuneiform signs, many with multiple meanings depending on context. They memorized long lists of synonyms, antonyms, and complex grammatical forms. They studied mathematics, using base 6-0 systems to perform calculations that could measure fields, calculate harvest yields, or predict astronomical events. They learned geometry and accounting, law and ritual, even medicine and divination. And above all, they practiced copying hymns, myths, contracts, and edicts until they could reproduce them flawlessly. The goal was not just literacy, it was mastery. A fully trained scribe had to be as comfortable calculating the volume of a granary as he was copying a hymn to Enlil. Scribes served in many roles. Some worked in temples, recording offerings, tracking the movement of herds, and maintaining property records. Others worked for kings, managing royal correspondence, documenting military campaigns, and drafting laws. Many scribes were employed by merchants, writing contracts, tracking debts, and overseeing trade. There were even freelance scribes, men who set up shop near the city gates or markets, offering their services to anyone who needed a legal document or a letter written. In a society where most people were illiterate, the scribe was indispensable. He was the voice of the written word, the bridge between spoken authority and enduring record. The tools of the trade were simple yet powerful. The stylus, a sharpened reed, pressed wedges into moist clay, which would be dried or baked, depending on how permanent the record needed to be. Scribes carried tablets of various sizes, suited to different tasks. Small ones fit in the palm for quick notes or receipts. Larger ones held contracts or literary texts. Some tablets were enclosed in clay envelopes, with summaries written on the outside, an ancient version of document security. Others were carefully labeled and stored in temple archives, their content preserved for future generations. What seems like a rudimentary system was, in practice, highly sophisticated. Physically, the work was demanding. Scribes often sat hunched for hours, their hands cramped from repetitive motion. Eye strain was common, especially in dimly lit rooms. Back pain, wrist problems, and fatigue plagued even the most experienced. Yet for all its toll, the profession offered dignity, purpose, and above all, permanence. A labourer's work might vanish with the next harvest, but a scribe's work could last thousands of years, and many have. Tablets written by humble scribes still bear their names, sometimes in colophons at the end of a text. Proud declarations like, I, Nabu-Dotzer, the scribe, wrote this tablet in the Temple of Ninurta, 15 Mynast. The scribe also played a role in shaping cultural memory. It was the scribes who copied and preserved myths, legends, epics, and prayers. Without them, stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Descent of Inanna would have vanished. Scribes were not just transmitters, they were curators, interpreters, and sometimes editors. In copying a text, a scribe might correct, adapt, or add notes. Their decisions influenced how stories survived and evolved. In this way, The scribes became co-authors of Mesopotamian culture. There was a spiritual dimension to their work. 2. Writing was not just a practical skill, it was a sacred act. In some texts, scribes are called the eyes and ears of the gods. The gods were believed to see all and to value record-keeping. To write was to imitate the divine, to bring order out of chaos, to fix the fleeting world into eternal lines. The gods themselves, according to Sumerian belief, kept tablets recording destinies. Enlil decreed fates. Scribes inscribed them. The line between divine law and written law was thin. Every tablet echoed the cosmic order. It's telling that in later Assyrian and Babylonian traditions, scribes continued to enjoy high status. They were still trained in the old Sumerian texts. Long after the language had died, Sumerian became a language of scholarship and religion, like Latin in medieval Europe. To be able to read and write Sumerian was a mark of education, tradition, and elite status. The scribes preserved not just records, but identity linking the present to a distant, revered past. To read a cuneiform tablet today is to step into the mind of a scribe, into his labor, his thoughts, his world. We see his hand in every wedge, his care in every line. These were not anonymous bureaucrats. They were thinkers, creators, preservers. Their work shaped the foundation of civilization itself. They taught us how to remember, how to reason, how to record truth, and how to speak across time. Once the stylus met the clay and the Sumerians began writing, they didn't stop. What poured forth was not just a trickle of simple records, but a flood of thought, structured, deliberate, and astoundingly diverse. The people of ancient Sumer wrote about everything. They inscribed the essentials of daily life and the questions of eternity. They recorded contracts and prayers, taxes and dreams, laws and myths. What they left behind, tens of thousands of tablets, is not just a record of events, but an archive of human thought. Through these clay documents, we gain a clear view into the earliest moments of civilization, the first attempts to make sense of the human condition. The largest category of surviving tablets consists of administrative and economic records. These may seem mundane at first glance: lists of barley rations, records of sheep delivered, tallies of laborers assigned to dig canals or construct buildings. But these documents are priceless. They tell us who held power, how resources were managed, what goods were traded, and how early economies functioned. They reveal complex systems of taxation, rationing, debt, and labor. They show temples acting as both spiritual centers and economic institutions. A single tablet might record that a temple official received 30 sheep from a herder, destined to be sacrificed during a ritual. Another might detail the distribution of beer, with specific amounts allocated based on social status and job. And beer, yes, they wrote about that too. Brewing was essential in Sumer. Barley beer was a staple of the diet, safer to drink than raw water, and rich in calories. There are recipes carved into tablets, complete with ingredient lists and steps. We even have hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, blending poetry and process. Reading such a text, we realize that the line between sacred and practical did not exist in the way it does now. Brewing beer could be both divine service and economic necessity. Legal texts make up another massive trove. Contracts for land purchases, marriage agreements, adoption papers, inheritance divisions, and records of legal disputes all survive. These documents lay out obligations, penalties, and witness statements in extraordinary detail. We can read, word for word, how two parties agreed to trade livestock, or how a father divided his estate among sons and daughters. Court cases even include witness testimony, judicial decisions, and fines imposed. From these texts, we understand not only law, but justice, how it was imagined, negotiated, and enforced in early cities. And we see that fairness, ownership, accountability, these concerns have always mattered. Then there are the letters, thousands of them. Personal, administrative, poetic, angry, loving. A merchant might write to a partner in another city about a delayed shipment of copper. A general might inform the king of a rebellion near the frontier. A father might scold his son for neglecting his scribal studies. These letters, etched into clay, reveal individual personalities in striking detail. We hear sarcasm, frustration, longing, humor. One letter from a merchant named Anunnaki, now famous, complains bitterly about receiving substandard copper and being treated rudely by the supplier's messenger. The tone is unmistakably human, annoyed, insulted, tired of being cheated. It could have been written yesterday. Beyond these practical texts lies the soul of Sumerian thought, their literature, their myths, hymns, laments, and wisdom texts form one of the richest and oldest bodies of written literature in the world. Here, scribes preserved not just data, but worldview. They wrote of gods and humans, of life and death, of creation and destruction. They crafted prayers filled with longing, hymns praising divine justice, laments mourning the fall of cities, and proverbs offering advice that still rings true. You entered the house full, you came out empty. One proverb warns perhaps a comment on greed or the risks of ambition. Another reads, "The liar's voice is sweet at first, but bitter later." The wisdom of the ancients was neither naive nor primitive. It was sharp, witty, and deeply observant. Some of the most haunting texts are the laments, poetic outpourings of grief composed after the fall of great cities like Ur. These were not only literary works, they were communal mourning, theological reflection, and political commentary. A lament might describe how temples were burned, gods abandoned their sanctuaries, and enemies led citizens into captivity. Yet amid the grief, there is always a thread of hope, that the gods might return, that the city might rise again, that divine favor might be restored. The laments teach us how ancient peoples processed catastrophe, how they coped with loss, and how they imagined renewal. The hymns and prayers to the gods are equally rich. They reveal a pantheon of complex deities: Enlil, Inanna, Utu, Enki, each with distinct personalities, powers, and domains. These were not simple gods. They could be wise or wrathful, nurturing or terrifying, just or capricious. Sumerians did not imagine the gods as flawless beings. They were powerful, yes, but also emotional, conflicted, and sometimes unjust. Worship was not just praise, it was negotiation, persuasion, even confrontation. A priest might write a hymn pleading for mercy, or a king might boast of having rebuilt a temple to win a god's favor. These texts show us a religion that was alive, intimate, fearful, reverent, and deeply integrated into everyday life. Perhaps most remarkable are the mythological epics narratives that explore the deepest questions of existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands out, of course, with its journey into mortality, grief, and the limits of human achievement. But there are many others: the Descent of Inanna, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, each revealing how the Mesopotamians understood their place in the cosmos. These stories are filled with divine counsels, sacred journeys, floods, and creation from chaos. Yet they are not just fantasies. They are frameworks, ways of understanding why we suffer, why we die, why we work, and how we relate to forces beyond our control. They even wrote about the stars. Astronomical texts survive that chart the movement of planets, eclipses, and constellations. They recorded celestial events and correlated them with omens, believing the heavens mirrored divine will. These weren't mere superstitions, they were careful, systematic observations over centuries. They tracked Venus, mapped lunar cycles, and built a tradition of sky watching that would influence later civilizations, including the Greeks. All of this contracts, letters, hymns, myths, laws. Astronomy came from clay, from styluses and mud, from minds trained in discipline and driven by devotion. These tablets were not just records, they were instruments of civilization. They taught, warned, remembered, and prayed, and through them, the Sumerians extended themselves across time. We read them now not as relics, but as voices. And in those voices, we hear a people who wanted to be remembered, who wanted to understand, and who believed deeply that what was written could touch the eternal. The gods of Sumer were not distant, aloof figures perched in an unreachable heaven. They were everywhere, woven into the rhythms of wind and water, fire and stone. They were the force behind every storm and every harvest. They dwelled in the city temples, walked through the myths, and sat in judgment over mortal deeds. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, complex, and hierarchical, reflecting the very society that created it. In these deities, we see not only a reflection of the natural world, but a projection of human society itself, structured, dynamic, and sometimes dangerously unpredictable. At the apex of this divine order stood An, the sky god, father of the gods. His name simply meant sky, and he represented the distant, overarching authority of the heavens. Though he played a relatively passive role in many myths, his position was foundational. An was the source from which divine authority flowed. Much like a king whose word sets the law, even if he rarely intervenes directly, his temple was in Uruk, but his influence extended across Sumer. He was the original archetype of divine kingship, the idea that above even the most powerful earthly ruler, a higher authority watches silently from above. If An was the source of divine power, it was Enlil who wielded it. Called the Lord of the Storm, Enlil was the god of air, wind, and fate. His domain was not merely the physical atmosphere, but the force of decision, the power that separated heaven from earth at the beginning of time. Enlil was the executive force of the pantheon, commanding, judging, creating order. He could be benevolent, granting fertility and abundance, but he could also be merciless. It was Enlil who sent the great flood in the Atrahasis epic, because humanity's noise disturbed his rest. His temple in Nippur was the religious heart of Sumer, revered by all city-states, no matter their political differences. Enlil's favor or his wrath could determine the fate of empires. In contrast to Enlil's stern authority stood Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian texts, the god of water, wisdom, and creation. Enki was the trickster, the innovator, the gentle protector of humankind. While Enlil punished, Enki preserved. He often worked behind the scenes, guiding events with cunning and care. In the Atrahasis, when the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, it is Enki who warns the hero in secret, ensuring the survival of life. His domain, the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, was both literal and symbolic. He brought knowledge, magic, invention. If Enlil was law, Enki was creativity. He was worshipped in Eridu, one of the oldest cities, where his temple was said to rest on the watery foundations of the world. Then there was Inanna, the most complex and electrifying figure in the pantheon, known later as Ishtar. She was the goddess of love, fertility, war, and political power. Her presence was irresistible. Inanna was not bound by simple categories. She was passion and violence, seduction and rage. She appears in poems as both lover and destroyer. Her temple in Uruk made the city a spiritual capital, and her worship involved elaborate rituals, music, and dance. The descent of Inanna, one of the oldest written myths, tells how she journeyed to the underworld, was judged and killed by the Anunnaki, and then resurrected. This cycle of death and return, love and loss, made her a deeply emotional deity, one who mirrored the extremes of human experience. Other major deities rounded out this divine council. Utu, the sun god, brought justice and truth. As he travelled across the sky each day, he saw all things. He was invoked in legal oaths, called upon in disputes, and honoured as a witness to both crime and virtue. His presence ensured that darkness could not hide wrongdoing. His twin sister was Inanna, tying the sun and the planet Venus, morning and evening star, into one celestial family. Nana, the moon god and father of Utu and Inanna, was the patron of Ur. His cycles governed time, calendars, and religious festivals. His cult emphasized order and wisdom, a quiet reflection of celestial regularity. Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, also called Mami or Ninmah, was the goddess of birth, fertility, and the mountains. She appears in creation myths as the one who physically molds humans from clay, shaping their bodies and imbuing them with divine essence. She was a symbol of nurturance and continuity, of the natural world's bounty and its role in sustaining life. Though not as flamboyant as Inanna, she was essential, her presence a reminder that creation and care are sacred acts. But the Sumerian pantheon extended far beyond this central group. Every city had its patron deity, each with unique temples, rituals, and festivals. Ningirsu of Lagash was a warrior god. Ninurta was a heroic storm deity who defeated chaos monsters. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, ruled the land of the dead with absolute authority. Her realm was gloomy and inescapable, and her presence in myth added a dark depth to the Sumerian understanding of death. There were gods of canals, brickmaking, herding, and healing. There were protective spirits, divine judges, cosmic scribes. The pantheon reflected the full complexity of life itself, its beauty, danger, mystery, and necessity. The relationships among these gods mirrored human politics. They loved, argued, conspired, made alliances. They convened councils to decree fate. They punished, forgave, and sought revenge. The divine world was not separate from the human. It was a larger, the more powerful version of the same structure. Kings ruled under the authority of gods. Temples were considered the actual homes of deities. Statues were not just symbols, they were vessels through which the gods interacted with the physical world. Daily rituals were performed to feed, clothe, and honor these gods, as if they were living beings requiring care. The belief was not metaphorical. The gods were truly present in the statue, in the temple, in the wind, in the grain. What made the Sumerian pantheon so extraordinary was its emotional realism. The gods were not perfect. They made mistakes. They could be cruel. They needed offerings, attention, loyalty. They were not distant creators, they were active participants in the lives of people and cities. Through this dynamic pantheon, the Sumerians made sense of uncertainty. Why did crops fail? Why did floods come? Why did children die? The answers were not always comforting, but they were present. The gods had their reasons, their tempers, their rivalries, and in serving them, humans hoped to find some measure of protection, or at least understanding. These divine stories and structures endured. Later civilizations, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian borrowed, adapted, and expanded upon this pantheon. Names changed, myths shifted, but the core remained. The Sumerian gods became part of the deep foundation of Mesopotamian spirituality, carried forward for over 2,000 years, and through the tablets they left behind, they still speak. We can read the hymns to Inanna, the prayers to Enki, the judgments of Enlil, We can hear the echoes of temples where priests chanted and scribes inscribed, where kings sought divine favor, and where ordinary people brought offerings to beings who, they believed, watched the world from mountain heights and starry heavens. The Sumerian gods were many things: creators, destroyers, judges, lovers, healers, and tricksters. But above all, they were a mirror. In worshipping them, the Sumerians were also confronting their own hopes, fears, and complexities. They were building a cosmos that made sense, a sacred order in which humans had a role, and where every storm, sunrise, or silence might carry a divine whisper. Among the vast constellation of Sumerian gods, one name has echoed louder than the rest in modern imagination: the Anunnaki. For some, the word conjures images of extraterrestrial engineers, ancient astronauts descending from the stars with mysterious technology. But the truth, as preserved in the original Sumerian texts, is both more grounded and more profound. The Anunnaki were not aliens. They were gods, divine offspring of heaven and earth, rooted in Sumerian theology and cosmology. To understand them, we must set aside modern mythologies and listen to the ancient voices that shaped the concept. The word Anunnaki comes from Sumerian roots, often interpreted as those of royal blood or offspring of An, referring to the sky god Andash, the father of the gods. The Anunnaki were divine descendants, and they formed a class of deities within the broader pantheon. Unlike Enlil or Inanna, who were highly individualized and had specific personalities, the Anunnaki were often described as a group, a divine assembly, or council. They appear in early texts as powerful cosmic judges, beings who administered divine law, who decreed fate, and who ensured the balance of heaven and earth. Their number and function varied depending on the era and the text. In some of the oldest Sumerian sources, the Anunnaki are referred to as 7 great gods who sit in council, a sort of celestial tribunal. These 7 were believed to be responsible for making high-level decisions that affected both gods and mortals. Later texts expand their number sometimes to 50, sometimes to 600, especially when Babylonian and Assyrian traditions reinterpret and integrate them into their own mythological frameworks. Regardless of the count, what remained constant was their association with divine authority and cosmic order. One of the earliest and clearest depictions of the Anunnaki's role comes from the descent of Inanna, a myth in which the goddess of love and war journeys to the underworld. When she arrives, she is brought before the Anunnaki, described as 7 fearsome judges. Their judgment is swift and merciless. They fix their gaze upon her, the look of death, and condemn her. She is stripped of power, killed, and her corpse hung on a hook. This moment reveals the Anunnaki as impartial enforcers of cosmic law. Not even a powerful goddess is exempt from their judgment. They do not speak much. They do not need to. Their authority is absolute, their role sacred. In this function, the Anunnaki are not creators or warriors. They are arbiters. Their judgment represents the unyielding forces of balance, the invisible yet ever-present structure beneath existence. They are not to be bargained with or flattered. Unlike other gods, who might be swayed by prayers or offerings, the Anunnaki operate with cold impartiality. They are like gravity, always present, rarely noticed until their weight is felt, but their role changes over time. In later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are more closely tied to the underworld. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Enkidu dreams of the afterlife, he sees the Anunnaki sitting in judgment over the dead. They weigh the lives of mortals, determining their fate in the gloomy world beneath the earth. Here again, they appear not as saviors or destroyers, but as keepers of order. Their presence gives structure to death itself, ensuring that even in the afterlife, justice persists. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, offers yet another view. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, the chaos dragon, and forms the world from her body, he assigns roles to various divine beings. The Anunnaki are among them. Marduk stations 300 Anunnaki in the heavens and 300 inches the underworld, dividing them as cosmic sentinels. This numerical symmetry is important. It represents cosmic balance. Half watch the skies, half guard the abyss. In this version, the Anunnaki are maintainers of creation, assigned their duties by the victorious creator god. What's crucial to understand is that the Anunnaki were never described in the original texts as beings who came from another planet or galaxy. They were born of An, sky, and Ki, earth, two primordial forces. Their existence was deeply tied to the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos as a three-tiered structure: the heavens above, the earth below, and the underworld. Beneath that, the Anunnaki moved among these realms as agents of balance. They did not arrive in spaceships. They did not dig for gold. They were part of a sacred, mythological framework that explained why life had rules, why death had consequences, and why justice mattered. Modern reinterpretations, most famously those of Zecharia Sitchin in the 20th century, have taken these ancient names and recast them in modern science fiction language. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were astronauts from a planet called Nibiru, who genetically engineered humans to mine gold. But such claims do not come from any Sumerian or Akkadian text. They are entirely modern inventions, based on misreadings, mistranslations, and creative speculation. The original texts, when properly translated and understood in context, describe the Anunnaki as divine beings within a coherent theological system, not extraterrestrials. In fact, the very idea of the Anunnaki as space travelers misunderstands how ancient peoples viewed their gods. The Sumerians did not see gods as physical beings limited to flesh or confined to machines. The gods were forces personalized. Yes, but not bound by human needs or limitations. A god could dwell in a statue, speak through an omen, appear in a dream, or move in a storm. The Anunnaki were no exception. They were spiritual entities, manifestations of divine will, not creatures flying ships through space. Their presence in myths served a purpose: to explain the structure of the world and the order of the divine realm. Why do some people prosper while others suffer? Why do the dead go to a shadowy realm beneath the earth? Why must fate be obeyed? The Anunnaki embodied those answers. They were the unchanging laws written into the fabric of existence. Their judgments were final. Their roles were eternal. That said, the fact that their identity shifts across texts, sometimes cosmic judges, sometimes underworld deities, sometimes celestial sentinels, should not be seen as inconsistency. Rather, it reflects the evolving nature of myth. Different cities, periods, and theological schools emphasized different aspects of the Anunnaki, but across all variations, they remained divine, powerful, and fundamentally non-human. Their mystery lay not in secret origins, but in the depths of what they represented: judgment, balance, destiny. So who were the Anunnaki? They were the divine council, the immortal administrators of cosmic law. They were born from heaven and earth, assigned roles in both life and death. They were the embodiment of order in a world filled with chaos, and through their silent gaze, their fixed decrees, they reminded every Sumerian that the universe was not random. It was structured, and some force was always watching. Among all the myths of Sumer, none is more evocative, more layered in meaning, than the tale of Inanna's descent into the underworld. It is a story of power, transformation, death, and resurrection, but it is also the story that gives us one of the most vivid portrayals of the Anunnaki, not as creators or rulers, but as relentless judges of the dead. In this myth, we see the divine world stripped of warmth and glory. We see the underworld as a place ruled not by mercy, but by order, and we see the Anunnaki as its keepers. Silent and terrifying, the story begins with Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, goddess of love, war, and fertility, deciding to descend into the land of no return, the Kur, the underworld, ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. Inanna dons her regalia, a crown, necklaces, breastplate, and scepter. She adorns herself not just with power, but with identity. Each piece symbolizes her authority in the world above. But as she descends, she is stopped at each of the 7 gates, and at each gate she is required to remove one item. By the time she reaches the throne room of Ereshkigal, she is naked and bowed low, a goddess reduced to mortality. This stripping is deeply symbolic. It's not just the removal of clothes, it's the dismantling of ego, status, divinity itself. Inanna must confront the core of her being, without armor or illusion, and when she arrives, it is not her sister alone who awaits her, it is the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld. The text is stark. They fixed their gaze upon her, the gaze of death. They spoke the word against her, the word of wrath. They shouted at her the cry of guilt. The afflicted Inanna was turned into a corpse. A piece of rotting meat was hung on a hook. Is omnis. This is not the romantic image of gods seated on golden thrones. This is judgment without plea. The Anunnaki do not explain. They do not justify. They see. They decree. And it is done. Even Inanna, one of the greatest of the gods, is subject to their authority in the realm of the dead. No status, no charm, no plea can save her. The message is clear. In death, all are equal, all are judged, and all must face the truth of who they are, without ornament or defense. While Inanna hangs lifeless, the world above begins to suffer. Crops wither, desire fades, life pauses. The absence of the goddess of fertility and love begins to unravel the living world. Enki, the god of wisdom, realizes the danger. Using clever magic, he creates 2 genderless beings who descend into the underworld to retrieve her. They do not demand her release. Instead, they empathize with Ereshkigal, who is groaning in pain. They show compassion, and in return, she agrees to give them Inanna's corpse. But resurrection is not easy. There is a law in the underworld one cannot leave unless another takes their place. This law is not negotiable. Even Inanna must comply. So she returns to the world of the living, but with demons at her heels, searching for a substitute. Eventually, her husband, Dumuzid, becomes the scapegoat, sent in her place. The cycle of descent, death, and substitution continues, a pattern reflecting the agricultural cycle of fertility and barrenness, life and decay. What's striking here is how central the Anunnaki are to this narrative. Their role is not elaborated with individual names or personalities. They are a collective force, embodiments of the law of the underworld. They act without hesitation or pity. Their power is not in speech, but in decree. Their gaze alone is enough to end a life. They do not rule like Enlil or create like Enki. They judge, and their judgments are irreversible. This myth also reveals the Sumerian conception of death. The underworld is not a place of reward or punishment, it is simply the realm of the dead, governed by rules and procedures. Everyone goes there, gods and mortals alike. The Anunnaki ensure that the balance is maintained. The dead must stay dead. The living must honor that boundary. Inanna's descent is a breach of that order, and it nearly causes cosmic collapse. The psychological depth of this story is extraordinary. Inanna's journey is both literal and symbolic. It is the journey into the unconscious, the confrontation with the shadow self, the stripping away of persona to reveal the raw essence of being. The Anunnaki, in this reading, are not just judges of the dead, they are judges of truth. They see through masks. They enforce authenticity. They ensure that nothing false enters the realm of eternity. The myth was not a marginal tale. It was recited, copied, and preserved for centuries. It influenced later myths in Akkadian and Babylonian cultures, and echoes of it can be found in Greek stories of Persephone, in Egyptian tales of Osiris, and even in later religious concepts of descent and resurrection, but the Sumerian version is the earliest, and it is the most unflinching. The Anunnaki's role here adds a powerful dimension to their identity. We have seen them in the Epic of Gilgamesh as judges of the dead, in the Enuma Elish as celestial sentinels, and now in the Descent of Inanna as enforcers of the underworld's inviolable laws. They are not creators, nor are they destroyers. They are the ones who maintain the cosmic boundary between life and death, illusion and reality, mercy and justice. Their power is not sensational, it is foundational. There is no greater expression of divine authority in Sumerian thought than the ability to judge without partiality. The Anunnaki do not act on whims. They are not bribed by offerings or softened by beauty. They execute the law of the universe. And in doing so, they embody the ancient Sumerian belief that behind the chaos of the world lies a deep, invisible structure, unseen but unbreakable. So the next time someone asks, "Who were the Anunnaki?" we should not point to the stars. We should look into the depths of myth, of death, of the human psyche. The Anunnaki are not aliens. They are us, and they are more than us. They are the keepers of the threshold. And when the moment comes that all else falls away, when titles and treasures no longer matter, it is their gaze we must meet. Of all the literary treasures etched into Sumerian and later Babylonian clay, none has endured with more resonance than the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is the oldest known heroic epic, and yet its themes are timeless: friendship, mortality, ambition, grief, and the longing for eternal life. But beneath the mythic adventures and the poetic grandeur lies another thread, the silent, unwavering presence of the Anunnaki, not as protagonists, but as shadowy forces shaping destiny. In this epic, they emerge again as judges of death, as reminders that even the greatest of kings must return to dust. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is a man of immense strength and unmatched pride. In the beginning of the tale, he is more tyrant than hero, overworking his people, taking what he pleases, unchallenged and unchecked. The gods, hearing the people's cries, create a wild man, Enkidu, to humble him. The two eventually meet not as enemies, but as equals. Their clash becomes a bond, and what follows is one of literature's most powerful friendships. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on quests to slay monsters and challenge the gods. They kill Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and later the Bull of Heaven, which Inanna sends in vengeance. These acts of defiance win them glory, but also doom. Enkidu falls ill, cursed by the gods for their arrogance. His slow, painful death becomes the emotional center of the story, and it is in the visions that precede his death that the Anunnaki reappear not as storm gods or distant cosmic forces, but as rulers of the underworld, as the final arbiters of fate. On his deathbed, Enkidu dreams of the afterlife. He sees a shadowy house, where the dead eat clay and dwell in silence. He sees kings and priests reduced to the same fate as beggars, and he sees the Anunnaki gathered, the great gods assembled. They fix their eyes on me, he says. They pronounce judgment, and I was made to kneel. This moment is chilling, even before death has claimed him. Enkidu feels the weight of divine verdict. The Anunnaki do not offer explanation or comfort. They simply decide, and their decision is final. This glimpse of the afterlife shakes Gilgamesh to his core. The mighty king, who once laughed at danger, is now broken by grief and terrified of death. He sets out on a quest not for vengeance, but for immortality. He wanders through deserts, climbs mountains, and crosses the sea in search of Utnapishtim, the survivor of the ancient flood. Gilgamesh wants the secret of eternal life. He wants to escape the fate that claimed his friend and waits for him. But what he finds is not a cure. Utnapishtim tells him the truth. The gods have decreed death for all humans. Eternal life was granted to him and his wife as a one-time exception, not a gift to be repeated. He recounts the flood story, including how Enlil sought to destroy humanity and how Enki subverted that plan. But even in that tale, the will of the divine assembly, likely including the Anunnaki, emerges as absolute. Their decrees are unchangeable. Life is a gift. Death is a boundary. To live forever is to violate the structure of the world. When Gilgamesh finally returns to Uruk, he is not immortal, but he is wiser. He inscribes his story on stone, a gesture that itself defies death. He understands now that while his body will fail, his words may endure. The epic ends not with conquest, but with acceptance. And behind it all, we still feel the presence of the Anunnaki not directly interfering, not speaking often, but always watching. Their role in the Epic of Gilgamesh may seem minor at first, but it is essential. They are the ones who judge. They do not chase heroes or send plagues. They wait, and when the time comes, they pass their sentence. In this, they reflect the Sumerian understanding of fate, not something to be negotiated or delayed, but something to be met with dignity. The Anunnaki are not cruel. They are inevitable. They are the law written in the stars and the soil. What's also notable is that in both the descent of Inanna and Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki serve the same function. They guard the threshold between life and death. They don't grant wishes. They don't console. They exist to ensure that the universe remains in balance. In a world filled with chaos, ambition, and uncertainty, they are the fixed point. And that is what makes them terrifying, not because they hate, but because they do not bend. Gilgamesh's journey is the human journey. The realization that no matter how strong, how loved, or how powerful we are, death comes for us all. And standing at the edge of that realization are the Anunnaki, silent witnesses to every life. Their judgment is not a punishment. It is a reminder that even kings must kneel, that even heroes must return to the earth. In reading this epic, we don't just encounter ancient myth, we encounter a mirror. We see ourselves in Gilgamesh, in his grief, his fear, his desperate search for meaning, and through the Anunnaki, we confront the truth that all humans must eventually face. Not with despair, but with humility. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not end in defeat. It ends with legacy, and it is through writing through the inscribed word that Gilgamesh finds a kind of immortality. Just as the scribes who copied his tale outlived their own lifetimes through the tablets they left behind, and just as we, today, reach across 4,000 years to hear their voices, the Anunnaki remain part of that legacy, not as aliens or monsters, but as sacred symbols of judgment, order, and cosmic justice. They are the invisible scribes of eternity, keeping record not just of deeds, but of meaning. And in their silent judgment, the Sumerians found a kind of peace, a knowledge that though we die, the universe endures. And if we are wise, we leave something of ourselves behind, not in defiance of death, but in harmony with the truth it reveals. In the vast library of ancient Mesopotamian thought, one text stands as a pillar of cosmic philosophy, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Though it emerged centuries after the Sumerians had laid their cultural foundations, it carried their spiritual DNA. The gods of Sumer returned in Babylonian form Anu, Enlil, Enki, now A, and most significantly, Marduk, the rising star of a new political age. The Enuma Elish did not merely explain how the world began, it justified the structure of divine and human authority. And once again, the Anunnaki appear not as creators, but as divine servants and witnesses to the reordering of the cosmos. The epic opens in a time, before anything had a name or a purpose. All that existed was water, the fresh waters of Apsu and the salt waters of Tiamat. These were not just elemental substances, but primordial deities, forces of existence itself. From their mingling, the first gods were born, and with their birth came movement, energy, disruption. The younger gods were noisy, chaotic. Apsu, longing for silence, plotted to destroy them. But Ea, the clever god of wisdom, "I've learned of this plan." He struck first, killing Apsu and building his temple on the subdued waters. Yet in doing so, a greater chaos was awakened. Tiamat, enraged at the death of her consort, prepared for war. She spawned an army of terrifying creatures, dragons, serpents, scorpion men, and appointed a new consort, Kingu, to lead them. She also gave Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, a divine artifact that granted supreme authority over the cosmos. With this, chaos did not merely resist order, it claimed the right to rule. The gods were terrified. One after another, they refused to face Tiamat's wrath. But then came Marduk, the son of Ea, powerful and ambitious. He offered to fight on one condition. If he succeeded, he would be made king of the gods. The Anunnaki, gathered in trembling assembly, agreed. They feasted, drank, and elevated Marduk to the role of supreme deity. It was a moment of cosmic politics. Authority was not seized, it was granted by consensus. And this consensus was ratified by the Anunnaki themselves, giving Marduk the legitimacy he needed to act as creator king. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is a thunderous confrontation of mythic proportions. Marduk arms himself with a net, storm winds, and a bow. When Tiamat opens her jaws to swallow him, he sends the winds into her mouth, distending her body. Then, with a single arrow, he pierces her heart. Her monstrous army flees, and Kingu is captured. The Tablet of Destinies is reclaimed. Order triumphs over chaos, but the story doesn't end there. From Tiamat's vast corpse, Marduk creates the world. He splits her in two, forming the heavens with one half and the earth with the other. He establishes the movements of the stars, appoints constellations, and organizes time. He creates the moon to govern months, the sun to rule days. The firmament becomes a calendar, a map, a machine of divine regularity. Through this act, Marduk imposes structure on the formless. Chaos is not destroyed, it is repurposed. And what of the Anunnaki? After the world is formed, Marduk gives them duties. He stations 300 inches the heavens and 300 inches the underworld. Their role is maintenance guardianship of creation, keeping watch over both the seen and unseen realms. Here, the Anunnaki are not rulers. They are divine functionaries, celestial administrators. Their power lies not in commanding, but in preserving. They are stability incarnate, balancing the vertical axis of the cosmos, sky, earth, and underworld. But the most significant moment comes when Marduk turns his attention to a new kind of creation, humans. The gods, weary of labor, complain. They've been digging canals, building temples, and organizing resources for too long. They want rest. Marduk proposes a solution. He will create a new being to bear the burden. Humans will serve the gods, tend their temples, maintain the offerings. But this new being must be made from something meaningful. So Marduk takes Kingu, the leader of the Chaos Rebellion, and slaughters him. From his blood, mixed with clay, he fashions mankind. This origin story is powerful in its symbolism. Humanity is born from divine rebellion and cosmic justice. We are made of earth and God blood. We are neither purely divine nor entirely mundane. We exist to serve, to maintain, to participate in the cosmic order. In this mythology, humanity is not cursed or fallen. We are created with a purpose. Our labor supports the gods, just as the gods support the universe. And the Anunnaki? They bear witness to this creation. They celebrate Marduk's triumph. They inscribe his 50 divine names, each representing a power, a role, a facet of divinity. They build his temple, the Esagila in Babylon, as the Axis Mundi, the sacred center of heaven and earth. The Anunnaki become the ceremonial enforcers of Marduk's kingship, just as they had once judged Inanna in the underworld and Enkidu at death's door. Their presence lends authority. Their silence is affirmation. The Enuma Elish is not merely a religious poem. It is a political document. It elevates Babylon's god to the highest throne, justifying imperial power. But it does so by wrapping politics in theology, grounding authority in cosmic balance. And it places the Anunnaki not at the top, but at the foundation. They are the gears of the great machine, the silent architects of continuity. What we see here is a transformation of their role. In earlier Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are judges, arbiters of fate. Stationed in the underworld, in the Enuma Elish, they evolve into divine witnesses and functionaries. This flexibility is not confusion, it is depth. The Anunnaki are not static deities. They are principles of divine law. Wherever balance is required, they appear. To say that the Anunnaki were merely mythical bureaucrats is to miss their power. They represent what all ancient peoples craved: certainty. In a world of storms, droughts, wars, and plagues, the Anunnaki reminded the people that some force was keeping watch. That chaos had been faced, judged, and reshaped, that the world had structure, and that every man, woman, king, and god played a role within it. The Enuma Elish closes with a celebration, a ritual recitation of Marduk's names. The Anunnaki bow in praise, their voices rising in song. This ritual was performed each year during the Akitu festival, reenacting creation, renewing the covenant between gods and humans. And the Anunnaki were there, year after year, in the chants, in the processions, in the sacred texts. Not aliens, not invaders, not mysteries waiting to be decoded, but the sacred embodiment of judgment, balance, and order, watching from the stars, from the clay, from the silence between words. In the oldest myths of Mesopotamia, humans are not the center of the universe. They are not the chosen ones, not born of divine favor or destined to rule all creation. In fact, the earliest explanations for human existence are starkly utilitarian and profoundly revealing. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians, believed that humanity was created for one primary reason: to serve the gods, to labor, to maintain temples, to perform rituals, and to relieve the divine beings of the burdens they no longer wished to carry. This was not seen as a punishment, but as purpose. Nowhere is this belief more clearly illustrated than in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text that predates much of the Enuma Elish and offers one of the earliest known creation narratives. The story begins before humans exist. The gods themselves are divided into two classes: the great gods, who rule, and the lesser gods, the Agigi, who toil. These lesser gods are assigned the exhausting tasks of maintaining the cosmos, digging canals, dredging rivers, raising temple platforms, and keeping the earth in working order. It is not noble work, it is backbreaking, endless labor. Eventually, the Agigi rebel. They burn their tools, abandon their posts, and surround the house of Enlil, demanding relief. They are angry, tired, and desperate. And the great gods, rather than crushing the rebellion, hold a divine council. It is Enki the clever, a compassionate god of wisdom who proposes a solution. Create a new being, one who is strong, obedient, and able to bear the toil. A worker, a human. The details of this creation are astonishing. The gods agree to sacrifice one of their own Geshtue, a deity associated with intelligence. His blood is mixed with clay, and from that divine mortal blend, the first humans are shaped. This act of mixing blood and earth is symbolic. Humans are not entirely divine, nor entirely dust. They are hybrids born of heaven's mind and earth's body, capable of reason, but bound by mortality. The goddess Ninhursag, also known as Ninmah or Mami in different traditions, performs the creation. She molds the first humans from the clay and carries them in divine wombs until they are born. The number of humans is small at first, 7 males and 7 females, but from them, the population grows. The gods are pleased. The Agigi are relieved. The temples will be built. The fields will be ploughed. The rituals will be performed. Creation has found its workforce. This myth turns many modern assumptions upside down. Humans are not created in the image of the gods to share in divine rule. They are created to serve. Their very existence is a response to a labor crisis. Yet this was not seen as degrading by the Mesopotamians. On the contrary, to serve the gods was to participate in cosmic order. Every offering placed at a shrine, every field harvested in the name of a temple deity, every brick laid for a ziggurat, these were sacred acts. Work itself was holy. This understanding of purpose shaped every aspect of Mesopotamian society. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic engines. They controlled vast estates, organized workers, distributed rations. Priests were not simply spiritual leaders, they were administrators, managers of divine property. And the people who worked for the temple's farmers, craftsmen, cooks, scribes were all participating in the sacred economy. Even the lowest laborer had a role in the divine system. Their sweat, their effort, maintained the relationship between humanity and the gods. Yet this relationship was not always smooth. As the Atrahasis epic continues, it describes the consequences of humanity's growth. The people multiply, and with them, their noise. The gods cannot sleep. Enlil, angered, decides to wipe them out. First with plagues, then with drought, then ultimately with the flood. Each time, Enki intervenes, finding ways to protect humanity, teaching them how to offer specific sacrifices, how to appease the angry gods. In the final catastrophe, he warns Atrahasis, the wise man, to build a boat. This story is echoed later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives the Great Flood. The flood narrative is critical. It shows that while humanity was created to serve, that service had limits. Excess, noise, disobedience, these could trigger divine wrath. The gods did not need humanity for companionship. They needed them for order, and when that order was disturbed, correction followed. But it was never absolute. Enki's compassion always returned the balance. The gods, though powerful, were not all cruel, and humans, though created to serve, were not disposable. There is a deep theological idea buried here, that suffering and struggle are part of the divine design. Life is not fair because it was never meant to be. It was meant to be functional. The gods had needs. The humans were their solution. Yet in that transaction, a kind of dignity was born. By serving, humanity found meaning, and by recording their rituals, by writing their myths, by building their temples, humans created culture. Even in the Enuma Elish, this same motif appears. Marduk creates humans from the blood of Kingu, the defeated leader of Tiamat's army. Once again, Humanity is born from rebellion and divine sacrifice. And once again, their purpose is clear: to relieve the gods of work. But the gods are not simply using humans. They bestow upon them law, a structure, wisdom. They assign the Anunnaki to watch over them. They create time, festivals, and rituals. The human experience becomes ordered, and that order is sacred. What's striking across all these narratives is the consistency. Whether Sumerian or Babylonian, early or late, the message remains. Humanity exists to serve the divine, and in doing so, they participate in something greater than themselves. This is not modern individualism. It is cosmic collectivism. Every person plays a role in maintaining the universe. And what about the Anunnaki in all this? They are the ones who authorize it. In the flood stories, they pass judgment. In creation, they bear witness. In the Enuma Elish, they ratify Marduk's kingship and assign humans their role. They do not create, but they legitimize. Their presence confirms that what is being done aligns with divine law. So when we ask, why were we created? The Mesopotamian answer is clear: to work, to serve, to uphold the balance between heaven and earth. But that service was not slavery. It was sacred duty. And in fulfilling it, humanity stepped into the divine order, becoming not rulers of the world, but its caretakers, long before the biblical tale of Noah and his ark, long before any mention of a deluge in Genesis. There was Atrahasis, one of the most powerful and emotionally charged epics in Mesopotamian literature, carved into clay around 1700 BCE, but based on even older oral traditions. The Atrahasis epic tells the story of humanity's origin, its relationship with the gods, and the devastating flood that nearly ended it all. In this narrative, we meet a familiar cast: Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and, once again, the ever-present Anunnaki. Here, their role shifts once more. They are no longer just judges or divine administrators. They become, for a brief moment, agents of life and of death, intertwined with humanity's very existence. The story begins at a time when only gods inhabited the world. The Igigi, younger gods, were tasked with maintaining the universe. They dug the canals, kept the rivers flowing, raised the embankments, and dredged the marshes. But the labor was endless, and after thousands of years, the Igigi rebelled. They threw down their tools and marched on Enlil's home in Nippur, demanding relief from their suffering. The great gods convened a council: Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the Anunnaki. This moment marks a pivotal shift in divine dynamics. The Anunnaki are no longer passive enforcers. They are participants in the deliberation. A decision is made: create humans to bear the burden. But humans are not created from nothing. As with the Enuma Elish, blood must be spilled. A god is chosen, Geshtue, whose name means ear or wisdom, symbolizing intelligence. He is sacrificed. His blood is mixed with clay, and from that mixture, the first humans are formed by Ninhursag, the mother goddess. Thus, human life begins part divine, part earthbound. Initially, the new creation works well. Humans serve the gods, build their temples, and feed them through offerings. The balance is restored. But as generations pass, humans multiply. They spread across the land, their voices rising in a clamor that disturbs the gods. The texts describe the noise as unbearable. Once again, it is Enlil who reacts. He cannot sleep. The humans are too loud, too numerous. His solution is drastic: reduce their numbers through plague. But Enki, ever the protector of humanity, whispers secret knowledge to Atrahasis. A wise and devout man, he instructs him to lead the people in specific rituals to appease the god of plague. The disease recedes. Order returns briefly. Then comes drought. Again, Enlil seeks to silence humanity's chaos through suffering. Crops fail. The rivers dry. Starvation looms. Again, Enki intervenes, guiding Atrahasis to perform a different series of offerings. The rain returns. Life is saved again, a third time. Enlil acts. Famine. Pestilence. Chaos. A third time. Enki counters him, frustrated and furious. Enlil calls a divine assembly. The gods must act decisively. And so, the most final solution is chosen, a flood, massive and inescapable, to wipe humanity from the face of the earth. This time, the gods swear an oath. No one must warn the humans. Silence is decreed. But Enki, bound by his oath, yet unwilling to watch humanity perish, finds a loophole. He speaks not directly to Atrahasis, but to the reed wall of his house. Knowing Atrahasis is listening, he says, "Man of Shurapak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life, roof it like the Apsu so that the sun cannot see inside." Atrahasis understands. He constructs the boat, he loads it with animals, provisions, and his family, and when the rains come, unleashed by the gods, he survives. The flood lasts 7 days and nights. The storm is described as deafening, furious, complete. When it ends, and the waters begin to recede, the gods look down in horror. The world is quiet. The smoke of offerings no longer rises. The temples are abandoned. No humans remain to serve them. The gods, hungry and regretful, weep. Even the mighty Anunnaki are shaken. Ninhursag mourns the destruction. "How could I have commanded such a fate?" she cries. "I gave birth to them, and now they are no more." The emotion in these lines is raw. The gods are not distant, they are grieving. They did not expect the silence to be so heavy. Eventually, the gods discover that Atrahasis has survived. Enlil is furious at first. Who broke the oath? But Enki defends his actions. "I did not speak to him directly," he insists. "I spoke to the wall." The gods relent. Atrahasis is spared. Life will go on, but with new rules. The Anunnaki, along with the greater gods, decree changes. From now on, not every woman will bear children. Some births will fail. Some women will be barren. Some children will die young. Priestesses will be celibate, dedicated to the gods. In short, mortality, infertility, and suffering are introduced not as punishment, but as population control. The flood was too final. A new balance is needed. This ending is as profound as it is bleak. Humanity survives, but life will never be easy. Suffering is built into existence, not because the gods are cruel, but because unchecked growth leads to collapse. The message is unmistakable. Life is a gift, but it comes with limits, and those limits are divine. The role of the Anunnaki in the Atrahasis epic is consistent with their portrayal across Mesopotamian literature. They are the divine council. They pass judgment. They decree fate. But they are also witnesses to regret. They see the consequences of divine decisions. They participate in course correction. Their silence, when they mourn the flood's destruction, is louder than any shout. They are not distant observers, they are co-authors of the human condition. And Atrahasis, he becomes the prototype for later flood survivors. His story is echoed in Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and centuries later in the story of Noah. But unlike those later figures, Atrahasis exists in a world where gods are not wholly good or evil. They are complex, conflicted, capable of love, fear, anger, and remorse. The flood, then, is not just a reset, it's a revelation. It shows that gods and humans are bound together. that divine decisions have consequences, that silence can be as deadly as speech, and that survival requires not just obedience, but wisdom, the wisdom of atrahasis, the courage to act, and the humility to listen to the whisper in the wall. The Atrahasis epic reminds us that the oldest questions are still the hardest. Why do we suffer? Why do we die? Why were we made? And though the answers may not comfort, they endure inscribed in clay, whispered by the gods, judged by the Anunnaki, and carried across centuries into our own fragile, searching hands. When the storm subsided and the world lay in silence, the gods looked down upon the earth and they wept. The Atrahasis epic, one of humanity's oldest written narratives, offers a startling reversal of expectations. The gods, who had once decreed the destruction of humankind through a flood of unimaginable force, now mourn what they themselves had wrought. In this quiet aftermath, we see the emotional core of Mesopotamian theology laid bare. The divine beings were not infallible, they were not beyond grief, and in that vulnerability, the Anunnaki, once fierce enforcers of divine order, become witnesses to the sorrow of their own decisions. As the waters recede and Atrahasis's boat rests upon the mountains, a deep silence falls. The noise of humanity, once so unbearable to the gods, is now gone. The cities are drowned, the temples are empty. The gods, who had relied on human offerings, now hunger. They have no smoke rising from sacrifices, no songs from priests, no rituals to receive. The balance they sought to restore has tipped too far. It is not just the world that has been cleansed, it is the bond between mortal and divine that has been severed. Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, is the first to voice the regret. She, who had moulded humanity from clay and divine blood, mourns the loss of her creation. How could I have commanded such evil in the assembly of the gods? She cries. Her words are full of maternal anguish. She does not merely lament the loss of life, she grieves the erasure of her children. It is a moment of profound emotional weight. And in that grief, we are reminded that the gods of Mesopotamia were never one-dimensional. They were vast, contradictory, painfully aware of their own limitations. The Anunnaki, too, are described as sitting in sorrow. Once the stern judges of the underworld, they now appear as somber figures, overwhelmed by the silence of the post-flood world. Their cosmic authority remains intact, but it is shaken. They had agreed to the destruction, they had stamped the decree. But now, in the absence of humanity, they recognize the cost of their verdict. There is no joy in annihilation, no satisfaction in silence. Even judgment, when too harsh, leaves wounds. This is one of the most startling theological ideas in ancient literature, that the gods, though powerful, can err. They can act too quickly, destroy too much, and regret the consequences. It is not weakness, it is complexity. And the Anunnaki, who often appear as cold enforcers of fate, are here shown to possess the weight of conscience. Atrahasis, meanwhile, survives, thanks to Enki's whispered guidance. When the storm clears, he offers sacrifices. The smoke rises, fragrant and warm, and the gods are drawn to it like flies. The hunger they feel is both literal and symbolic. They miss the offerings, yes, but more than that, they miss the connection to the world. Without humans, there is no praise, no ritual, no relationship. The gods exist, but they are alone, and that, for divine beings bound to order and meaning, is unbearable. Enlil, who had led the charge to destroy humanity, arrives and is furious to discover a survivor. Who broke the oath? Who revealed the secret? He demands. His rage is not just at the survival, it is at the betrayal of the divine decision. But Enki, ever the intermediary, speaks with calm defiance. He reminds Enlil that wholesale destruction was a mistake. that there are other ways to maintain balance. That life, once ended, cannot easily be restored. And here, a compromise is born. The gods agree that humanity must continue, but with limits. They decree the introduction of death not as punishment, but as necessity. They will instill infertility, infant mortality, and religious celibacy to naturally control population. These new boundaries are harsh, but they are seen as more merciful than divine slaughter. It is a grim solution, but a lasting one. What is most haunting in this resolution is its emotional ambiguity. The gods do not celebrate. They do not declare victory. They simply accept the burden of their own limitations. They have learned that power without wisdom is dangerous. And the Anunnaki, once again, are the keepers of that new order. They do not speak, but their silence is telling. They have judged, they have witnessed, and now they must carry the memory of what judgment costs. This moment is more than myth, it is a meditation on responsibility. The Mesopotamians were keenly aware of how fragile life was. Floods, droughts, and plagues were constant threats. The gods were powerful, but not always kind, and so they imagined a universe in which even the gods could suffer the consequences of their decisions. The Anunnaki are not all-knowing, they are bound by the system they enforce. They are participants in a cosmic drama where error is possible, and grief is real. Atrahasis, the man who lived, fades into the myth after the flood. Some later versions have him rewarded with eternal life. Others leave him anonymous. One survivor among ruins, but his story remains the man who listened, who obeyed, and who endured. He stands as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of divine wrath, wisdom and humility can prevail. The flood narrative echoes across cultures. The Hebrew Bible, Greek mythology, and Hindu scriptures all carry similar stories. But the Atrahasis epic stands apart for its raw humanity. It does not sanitize the gods. It does not frame the flood as a test or a moral punishment. It presents a complex cosmos, filled with beings divine and mortal, trying to maintain a fragile balance. And in doing so, it offers something rare: empathy. The Anunnaki are at the center of this empathy. Their presence is not dramatic but essential. They are the constants in the narrative, the ones who judge, who mourn, and who ensure that the cycle continues. They do not stop the flood. They do not speak to Atrahasis. But they are there, silently watching as life ends and then begins again. Through them, the Mesopotamians envisioned a universe where order must be upheld, but where even gods can grieve. A universe where justice and compassion must coexist, even when they seem in conflict, and a universe where survival of stories, of people, of meaning is always the greatest victory. The image of ancient Sumerian gods descending from the skies in spacecraft to mine gold and genetically engineer humankind has captivated millions. It's dramatic, provocative, and certainly entertaining, but it is not what the tablets say. And when we take the time to truly understand these texts line by line, sign by sign, we find not science fiction, but something far more human and enduring. The misreading of these tablets, particularly by proponents of ancient astronaut theories, has caused a widespread misunderstanding of one of the world's oldest and most significant civilizations. It has turned metaphors into machines, myths into manuals, and priests into pilots. To begin with, it's important to understand how the Sumerian and Akkadian texts are structured. Cuneiform is not a simple script. It evolved over thousands of years, with hundreds of signs that could represent syllables, whole words, or abstract ideas. The same symbol could mean different things depending on context. Without training in grammar, syntax, and the cultural meanings embedded in each sign, translation is difficult, sometimes impossible without guesswork. Yet many of the most popular alternative theories rely on surface-level or outright incorrect translations. For example, the term Anunnaki, which is central to both Mesopotamian religion and modern speculation, does not mean those who from heaven to earth came, as is often claimed. Linguistically, it is constructed from an, heaven or sky, unna, offspring or princely, and a suffix indicating a collective. Most scholars agree that it simply means offspring of An, referring to a group of deities born of the sky god. Nowhere does it imply movement from one planet to another. It is a title, not a travel itinerary. Another key misunderstanding revolves around the Sumerian word Nibiru. In popular pseudo-historical literature, Nibiru is imagined as a rogue planet with a 600-year orbit, home to the Anunnaki. In actual Babylonian astronomy, however, Nibiru refers to a point of crossing most often associated with the planet Jupiter when it crosses certain zones in the sky. Sometimes it's used for Mercury, and in other contexts, it refers to the crossing point of rivers or stars. It is never described as a planet inhabited by gods, and certainly never as a homeworld for extraterrestrials. Perhaps the most persistent distortion is the idea that the Sumerians recorded gold mining as a task imposed by the Anunnaki upon early humans. This claim appears nowhere in the cuneiform record. While Mesopotamians valued gold, it was associated with divine light, kingship, and temple wealth, not atmospheric repair. The detailed administrative tablets of Sumer record everything from grain rations to goat inventories, but not one tablet describes aliens directing human labor to extract precious metals for off-world transport. Many of these errors stem not from malicious intent, but from a lack of training in the language and a willingness to read ancient texts through a modern lens. When an author sees the word sky associated with a deity, they may imagine a flying craft. When they see creation or clay, they think of genetic engineering. But this is anachronism, projecting modern ideas onto ancient symbols. It's like reading a medieval prayer and assuming the angels were drones because they flew and reported information to a higher authority. Misreadings also occur through deliberate cherry-picking of lines. For example, in the Enuma Elish, when Marduk defeats Tiamat and organizes the cosmos, it's presented as a violent act of cosmic surgery. Some reinterpret this as a physical planetary collision or terraforming operation, but within the text, it's clearly a metaphor for order emerging from chaos. The gods are not engineers, they are personifications of natural forces and social ideals. The battle is spiritual, mythic, and symbolic. Likewise, in the Atrahasis epic, the gods create humans to relieve themselves of labor. This has been twisted into a narrative of alien exploitation. But the original story is not about enslavement, it's about balance. The gods are overwhelmed, so they delegate responsibility. The humans are not mistreated, they are celebrated as sacred workers whose offerings keep the divine world in harmony. The idea that humanity was created for toil was not viewed as tragic by the Mesopotamians, it was seen as meaningful. Scribes, too, are often misunderstood. In ancient astronaut theories, they are sometimes portrayed as recorders of alien encounters, as if they were witnesses writing down visits from spacefaring beings. But real scribes were deeply embedded in their society's intellectual and religious life. They were trained in theology, mathematics, agriculture, astronomy, and law. They composed hymns and copied texts not to document sightings of technology, but to preserve knowledge, interpret the cosmos, and maintain ritual continuity. It's important to remember that ancient people were not fools. They were not mistaking metal ships for gods. They were developing sophisticated theological systems to explain their world. Their gods reflected their environment, the unpredictability of rivers, the violence of storms, the mystery of birth and death. They created myths that encoded their values, fears, and hopes, not instruction manuals from aliens. The danger of misreading these texts isn't just academic, It removes agency from ancient civilizations. It suggests they couldn't have built their own cities, invented writing, or developed astronomy without outside help. It strips them of their brilliance, replacing real achievements with imagined interventions. This diminishes not only their memory, but our own understanding of human potential. That's not to say we must reject mystery. Ancient texts do raise profound questions. Why did so many cultures have flood myths? Why do themes of judgment, cosmic order, and divine justice repeat across millennia? These are important inquiries, but the answers lie in anthropology, theology, psychology, not in fiction posing as history. The cuneiform tablets deserve better. They are among the oldest surviving voices of human civilization. They contain poetry, law, lamentation, math, astronomy, love songs, and funeral rites. They reflect a world alive with wonder, where people sought to align themselves with the will of the gods, not because they feared spaceships, but because they feared disorder, famine, and oblivion. To read them honestly is to encounter a civilization of immense depth. To misread them is to lose that civilization in the noise of our own modern fantasies. The real magic is not in finding ancient aliens. It's in realizing that 5,000 years ago, ordinary people used mud and reed to speak across time, and that they still have something to say. They were not meant to survive forever. The Sumerian scribes, seated in temple courtyards or palace rooms, shaped wet clay under the midday sun, recording grain receipts, prayers to the gods, laws, contracts, hymns, and epics. They did not know that thousands of years later, their tablets would be unearthed from ancient ruins and read under electric light in distant lands. They could not have imagined the wonder, debate, or distortion their words would provoke. And yet, those clay voices still speak, not just as relics of a vanished world, but as testaments to the first great effort to organize thought, structure society, and understand the cosmos. The true message of the tablets is not encoded in secrets or buried beneath conspiracies. It is written openly, in wedge-shaped marks pressed patiently into mud. It tells the story of a people who, faced with the challenges of a harsh environment, invented writing not as an artistic luxury, but as a tool for survival. They used it to record the allocation of barley, to track the labor owed to temples, to document marriages, disputes, and debts. From this pragmatic beginning emerged something extraordinary: literature, law, theology, and memory. These tablets are not evidence of forgotten technology or lost alien contact. They are human, painfully, beautifully human. In them we find kings asserting their dominance, priests invoking divine justice, merchants bargaining over goods, and lovers composing tender verses. We read laments over ruined cities, petitions to gods for healing, and mathematical calculations etched with stunning precision. The language may be ancient, but the experiences are familiar: love, fear, ambition, grief, curiosity. The tablets remind us that the people of Mesopotamia were not so different from us. The Anunnaki, so central to many of these texts, were never portrayed as robotic overlords or interstellar miners. They were symbols of permanence, of invisible laws that governed the world. They represented the inevitability of death, the structure of society, the mysterious judgment that comes after life. When kings invoked their names, it was to declare their legitimacy. When scribes referenced them, it was often to ground moral or cosmic truth. The Anunnaki were not figures of terror, they were reflections of divine order. And like that order, they were often silent but always present. The real message of the tablets lies in their consistency and their continuity. Over millennia, scribes copied and recopied the same myths, laws, and prayers. The language evolved from Sumerian to Akkadian, but the cultural core endured. The myths of Inanna, Enki, and Gilgamesh were passed from city to city, from empire to empire. Even when Assyrians and Babylonians rose to power, they looked back to Sumer as the source of wisdom. They preserved the old stories because they still mattered. And what do those stories say? They say that power must be tempered by humility, that even kings must answer to divine law, that death is universal, and in its face, love and friendship are what matter most. They say that creation is a struggle against chaos, and that order must be renewed constantly through ritual, justice, and memory. They say that humans were made to serve, not as slaves, but as caretakers of the divine structure of life. They remind us that suffering has always been part of the human condition, and so has the search for meaning. One tablet may tell of how to measure a field, another of how to honor the gods with incense and song. One may list temple workers, another may sing of Inanna's descent into darkness. Taken together, they form the architecture of the world's first known civilization, a civilization that believed in law, time, balance, and the soul. This was not a culture of despair, despite wars, floods, and famines. The Sumerians built cities, designed complex irrigation systems, mapped the stars, and gave us the foundations of math and writing. They could have surrendered to the elements. Instead, they chose to inscribe meaning into clay. That choice echoes through history. It is the origin of record-keeping, storytelling, and the belief that knowledge can outlast mortality. When we read their tablets today, we do more than decode symbols. We listen to voices that refuse to be forgotten. A father writing to his disobedient son, a king boasting of temple restoration, a priestess lamenting the fall of her city, a scribe reciting the names of gods in perfect meter. Their words were not written for us, and yet they reach us crossing centuries, empires, and languages. Even the most mundane tablets, those listing oil rations or animal counts, contain something precious. They show the world as it was lived. They show a society so organized, so literate, so committed to recording truth, that nothing was too small to be remembered. These were not primitive people. They were among the most sophisticated of their time, and their legacy is etched into the clay of our own civilization. We must be careful, then, not to drown their voices in fantasies. The temptation to see ancient wisdom as alien technology does not elevate the past, it erases it. It turns myth into mechanism, prayer into programming, gods into gadgets. But the real achievement is more miraculous, that with no modern tools, no digital databases, the Sumerians created a complete system for understanding the universe and themselves. Their tablets tell us that time is sacred, that words hold power, and that meaning can be preserved in the humblest of materials. In the brittle, baked remains of their writing, we find the roots of history, law, literature, and spiritual thought. And at the heart of it all, we find a people who ask the same questions we still ask today. What is my purpose? What happens when I die? What do the gods want from us? And though the answers vary from tablet to tablet, from myth to hymn, one message remains constant. We are not alone, not because aliens descended in ships, but because our ancestors left behind their minds, their dreams, and their fears waiting to be read.